Hello everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from our Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Tonight's story, Counterfeiters. Hello there. It's around this time of year that the merchants and businessmen examine their silver and paper currency carefully, for this is the season when counterfeiters get in their best work. Of course, since the FBI and the Treasury Department's Secret Service have raised crime detection to its present high state of science, counterfeiters are a lot less successful than they used to be. In fact, they have made it another bit of evidence that crime does not pay, and it never did. But back in the early days of Grays Harbor, when folks were trusting and the harbor was off the beaten path of commerce, there were many counterfeiting scares that gave the harbor plenty to talk about. We've located a couple of those cases in the scrapbook, and tonight's pages contains a yarn about spurious moneymakers and what happened to them in the days when the harbor was very young. But first, a few words from Dick Crombie and our sponsors. The story of the early West was filled with chapters about counterfeiters. The great western country, with its isolated settlements, its friendly, gullible people, was an ideal operating ground for city slickers, and counterfeiting was one of their specialities. So early day newspapers are filled with notes about those operators who made their money, in the manufacturing sense of the word, and passed it off on the honest merchants and business folks. There was one listed on the Aberdeen police blotter in 1901. His name was H.N. Jones, and his story, as old-timers recall it, was typical. He came to town from Tacoma to buy real estate, so he said. But while he didn't buy much real estate, he did dabble considerably in small purchases. He picked up a package in the Blue Front liquor store and paid for it with a $20 bill, taking most of the total of the value of the bill in change. He had a few square meals at the Boston Oyster House, paying each time with a fresh new $20 bill and pocketing a wad of change. He bought a few trifles at Payne's drugstore and paid for them with a 20. He purchased a tie at the Boston store from J.H. Reed and handed him a brand new $20 bill. And so on it went. Each purchase was made with a new $20 bill, and each time it was a small purchase. The stranger took most of his $20 in change. He worked Hoquiam and Cosmopolis. Then Chief of Police W.H. Annis sounded the warning. Spurious $20 bills are turning up on Grays Harbor. Examine all $20 bills carefully before you take them. And the police went to work. Of course, the trail led to the stranger, H.N. Jones, who had just purchased his ticket to leave town on the afternoon train. And it was an easy finish for what might have been a tough case. Jones' pockets were stuffed with the bad bills, and he carried a roll of good money and a bag of silver that was his profit from his trip to the harbor. Of course, federal authorities took over at once and trailed the spender of bad money to Tacoma, where in a small run-down print shop they located the entire gang, the dyes, presses, and equipment, and the case made headlines all over the Northwest. Chief Annis was praised by Seattle and Portland papers for his work in bringing the gang to justice. But that was just a routine case as counterfeiting went. The big case of spurious money, as old-timers recall it, was the case of the $5 gold pieces that happened about 10 years later. In fact, it was cleared up in February 1912. Now, Ed Tribbets, who lived over on Thomas Street, was a captain of Aberdeen Police. He wasn't a professional officer as we think of one today. Ed had worked at the Slade Mill and several other local mills and had taken the job on his police force for a change. But he proved such a good law enforcement man that in no time at all he had moved up to captain under Chief Templeman. And one day in February 1912, the 22nd to be exact, Captain Trivets took a couple of men to a house in North Aberdeen, and in a few minutes, about as long as it takes to tell about it, he had been smashing up Grays Harbor's slickest counterfeiting ring. G.E. Harrington and W.H. Mahan went behind bars, and the city piled up a stack of evidence against them, garnered from Trippett's raid. Let's go back to the beginning of our story. It was around Christmas time, 1911, that the $5 gold pieces began to make their appearance on Grays Harbor. Now, a $5 gold piece today would arouse a lot of interest, but then, with plenty of gold in circulation, it was quite a common medium of exchange. So merchants and business folk took the gold coins and said nothing until someone began to find counterfeit gold fives at the bank. There was no publicity on it, except that the bank passed along the world to watch out for a bag of gold, and the police entered the case. It was a blank wall, the one that they were up against, and they started by questioning some of the merchants who had been passed the gold coins. One of the passers were Mahan, the machinist in the Douglas Brothers machine shop and foundry on River Street. It was hard to check exactly which coin the man had passed, but finally they learned that Dan Bowes had completed the transaction with the fellow, and among other coins taken a $10 gold piece. Dan still had the gold coin, and the officer gave it the test. It was good. It was pure gold in the realm, and that threw them off. Now, when Ed Trippett had worked in the Slade Mill, Mahan had been an employee of that firm, and the police officer recalled that Mahan had shown a great deal of interest in metals. He had noticed him making tests with acids, grinding small parts, and genuinely working with metal. Mahan had left town soon after that and had been gone for a year, but he had been back on the harbor for some time now, and since he was now with the foundry, it was only logical that his interest had been of a professional nature, and that he was interested in things that had been hoped to make a profession of some day. However, Trippett's began to follow the metalworker. He found that he had made frequent trips to North Aberdeen to the residence of G.E. Harrington, a streetcar conductor on the Broadway Cosmopolis run. They were often seen together, and they made mysterious purchases and had odd meetings at late hours. One day, a fake gold coin turned up in the change of an Aberdeen woman who had received when she paid her streetcar fare. That was enough for Trippett. He felt that it had the combination at last, but he needed evidence. It was now the middle of February 1912, and one morning Trippett's received word that Mahan was leaving town. An informant who worked with the machinist at the foundry dropped the word that Mahan was going to accept a job in a metalworking plant in Portland, Oregon. Trippett's knew he had to work fast. He felt that if he could search the North Aberdeen house, the home of the streetcar conductor, he would find his answer. But that would take a warrant. He knew that once a warrant was issued for a search, Mahan would get the word and might try to beat the law out of town. But he noticed something. Somewhere, first step had to be made. The captain talked it over with Chief Templeton, and they decided on quick action right now. The first act was to obtain the warrant for the search of the North Aberdeen residence. They picked a time when the streetcar conductor would be home. They knocked heavily at the door of the house near Fern Hill. Harrington answered and invited them in. But after a thorough search of the house, they turned up nothing. They were about to leave when Trippett's, making a circle of the premise, discovered a small building out back, disguised as a woodshed. It had a room within a room, and when the room was searched, they had their evidence. They found the tools for making dyes, presses, melting pots, metals, acid, scales, blowing torch, forge, arrangements for metals to metal making. No dice, no coins. There was still a missing link. However, they took Harrington to the city jail and started out gathering up what the man believed to be accomplices. Captain Triplett stood in the shadow across G Street from the entrance to the foundry for quite some time. He watched the men as they came out, and when Mayhem came out, he trailed him. At the corner of Hume G Street, he stepped up to the machinist and made the arrest. With Chief Templeton, who had been waiting at the corner, Mayhem was marched to the jail. As the prisoners walked between the two officers, he suddenly thrust a hand into his pocket and made an attempt to throw something into the vacant lot on Market Street. But the chief seized his hand. Triplets opened his clenched hand, and there was the evidence he sought, a $5 gold piece, or what appeared to be a $5 gold piece anyway. When Mayhem was searched at the jail, he was found to have a new set of dies that he had completed at the machine shop during his working hours. A test of the $5 gold piece proved it to be spurious. Templeman was sure that the case was closed, but Trippets was not satisfied. Somewhere he knew there were other dies, the dies that had been used to make the coins in circulation. The prisoners could prove that he had made the dies held by the police that very day, and the examination would show that they had never been used. The $5 coin in his possession could have been acquired by some other source. Oh, Captain Trippets could see holes in the evidence that was good for any lawyer who would take the case. But that night, the prisoner made his biggest mistake. He presumed on his one-time friendship with the police captain. He sent for Trippets to come to his cell and told him the whole story. Then he asked the police captain to help him. There were dies in his room, he told Trippets. They were hidden in his closet. They were the ones used for the manufacture of the coins. If they were destroyed, he, Mayhem, would have a chance. But Captain Trippets hadn't cased his quarry for three months just to let him go at the last minute. He searched Mayhem's room and found the coins, but they weren't destroyed. They were later presented as evidence that sent the counterfeit to prison for a long term. Sheriff Pyatt, who had been busy on the Tornow case, was called down from Montesano to take the prisoners into custody for safekeeping. He turned them over to T.B. Foster, the Secret Serviceman, who came to the harbor. And from Harrington came a signed confession to his part in the counterfeiting. That broke the case completely. And the Aberdeen police were lauded for their work in nipping a major counterfeiting racket in the bud. And now, Dick, a few words from our sponsor. Grays Harbor today has reason to be proud of its law enforcement agencies. They are composed of trained men, many of them professional officers equipped with all the new weapons and crime detection and prevention to make crime even more unpopular today as a career, as it was in the days of Jesse James. But the old Grays Harbor had its law and order too, as it goes to show. But the long arm of the laws of the harbor city started at the primitive stage that most western towns experienced when a few scattered huts began to shape up in town. In Aberdeen, the town's first official law enforcer was Joe Graham, that colorful recorder of the harbor's earliest history. Joe was the town's marshal, and as such ruled the little bastille down on South G Streets, where the wayward found lodgings in the cold dampness of a wooden cell. The town jail, which was located about where Benny's Lock Canton restaurant now stands, was, like all city pioneer buildings, a wooden structure. But the builder of the dungeons were shrewd men, and they reckoned with the days when someone would try to wilt within his jail out with a pocket knife. So, when they laid up the siding of the sheath walls, they laminated the structural member and drove nails every 2 inches in all directions. A good whittler could still carve his way to freedom if he wanted to work around the metal. But it did add quite a handicap, and so far as I've discovered, no one ever managed to whittle his way out of the wooden Aberdeen jail. But when that building was swept by fire during the blaze of 1903 that burnt the business district of the city, the nails driven into the wood of that little building, plus fire retardant characteristics of the laminated walls, made the walls of the Aberdeen jail stand. Even after the fire had burnt the roof off and gutted the interior of the building. In fact, the walls of the little wooden jail were the only break in the shuttering tad lines, except for a few bank vaults and one or two telephone poles when the flames of the big blaze died down. Well, that's all for this time. But we'll have another story tomorrow night, a story that has lots of laughs and the sounds something like Damon Runyon. It's the story of George the Greek, who wrestled the world's champion in an Aberdeen theater and made his place in our hometown scrapbook. Thanks for listening.